the twilight of his extraordinary life, as the golden light of the Vatican gardens fell gently across the cobbled stones, there was a simple, quiet companion who never left Pope Francis's side. His name was Esteban, a modest, sandy-colored dog rescued from the streets of Rome early in Francis's pontificate. It was said among those closest to the Holy Father that Esteban had wandered into the Vatican one rainy morning, soaked, shivering, and half-starved, when the Pope himself spotted him from a window and insisted that he be brought inside. It was such a small act, almost invisible to the wider world, but it revealed everything about the man who had taken the name of Francis, the saint who loved all creatures, great and small. From that day forward, Esteban became not just a pet, but a silent witness to the final tender chapters of the Holy Father's journey, a reminder that even in the highest halls of power, God's smallest creatures still speak the language of loyalty and love. Esteban was never paraded before cameras. There were no official photos, no grand announcements. His place was not among dignitaries or officials, but tucked quietly by Francis's chair as he prayed, sitting at the Pope's feet during long meetings, walking slowly beside him in the hidden gardens when he needed moments of solitude. Vatican staff quickly learned to leave the pair undisturbed. In the simple presence of the little dog, the Pope found a rare and comforting stillness, a reflection of God's gentleness in a world often too busy to notice. Esteban had a way of resting his head against Francis's worn shoes, looking up with eyes full of quiet devotion, as if he understood the burdens the Holy Father carried. And in those eyes, Francis found a wordless prayer, a companionship that asked for nothing, demanded nothing, but gave everything. The days with Esteban became an invisible rhythm woven into the Pope's life, a small grace in a life filled with unimaginable responsibilities. Early in the mornings, before the world's eyes turned toward the Vatican, Pope Francis would stroll slowly through the hidden corners of the Apostolic Palace gardens, Esteban trotting faithfully beside him. Sometimes the Holy Father would pray aloud as he walked, his voice soft and steady, lifting up the broken-hearted, the poor, the abandoned. Other times, he would remain silent, letting his prayers rise from the simple act of being, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling the presence of God in the whispering olive trees, the singing birds, and the loyal little creature at his feet. Vatican workers occasionally caught glimpses of them, the aged pontiff and the humble dog, walking side by side like old friends who needed no words to understand one another. In Esteban, Pope Francis seemed to find a reflection of the gospel itself, simple, pure, faithful. There were days when the meetings were endless, the documents heavy, the burdens of leadership almost unbearable. And yet when Francis returned to his modest rooms, Esteban would be there, his tail wagging slowly, his brown eyes lifting to meet his master's, as if to say, "You are not alone." It was in those small, unnoticed moments that the Pope smiled most sincerely, reaching down with a tired hand to scratch behind the dog's ears, whispering prayers only God and Esteban heard. This companionship, hidden from public speeches and flashing cameras, became one of Francis's most treasured gifts, a reminder that greatness is not found in thrones or crowns, but in the tender, everyday acts of love that so often go unseen by the world, but never by heaven. As the years pressed on, both man and dog grew older together. Esteban's muzzle turned gray, his steps slower, yet he remained as constant as the sunrise. When the Pope knelt in prayer, Esteban lay beside him. When the Pope received visitors, Esteban watched quietly from a corner, his presence a silent sentinel of the sacred. And as whispers of the Pope's declining health began to spread within the Vatican walls, a slow, aching realization that the Holy Father was preparing for his final journey home, Esteban stayed closer than ever, sensing somehow that the man he loved was approaching the great threshold between this world and the next. The Vatican corridors grew quieter as the news, though unspoken publicly, spread among those closest to Pope Francis. His time on earth was drawing to a close. The Holy Father, who had spent years carrying the woundedness of the world upon his shoulders, now bore his own frailty with the same humility and peace he had always preached. His steps slowed, his voice softened, but his spirit never dimmed. Prayer became his constant companion, and so did Esteban, never more than a few feet away from his side. Those who tended to the Pope marveled at the dog's unwavering devotion. Esteban seemed to know without being told. He followed Francis with a tender seriousness, lying by his bedside when he rested, accompanying him down long marble halls when he had the strength to walk, never needing to be summoned, never needing a command. In the quiet twilight hours, when the world beyond the Vatican walls buzzed on with its endless noise, a different world existed inside, one of stillness, prayer, and deep love. Sometimes, those close to Francis would find him sitting quietly in his simple chair, Esteban curled at his feet, a rosary slipping through his fingers as he whispered Hail Marys into the silence. Other times, he would speak softly to Esteban, as if confiding his last hopes and dreams to the creature who had shared his final years. "Soon I will see him face to face," he would murmur, smiling faintly as Esteban lifted his head at the sound of his master's voice. There was no fear in Pope Francis's heart, only the calm certainty of a man who had lived for others, who had embraced the gospel with his whole soul, who had loved to the end. Those sacred days were filled not with grand declarations, but with the small, luminous acts of faithfulness that truly define a life. Esteban's simple presence, his warm, steady breathing, his patient vigil, became a kind of living prayer, an unspoken litany of love and loyalty offered up to heaven. The staff whispered among themselves that Esteban seemed to be preparing too, that the little dog's gaze grew more sorrowful, more tender, as if he too understood that a farewell was near. And in that understanding, there was no panic, no despair, only love, deeper and stronger than words could ever express. The morning of his final day was unusually still, as if even the very air of the Vatican held its breath. The sun rose softly over the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, casting long golden beams into the Pope's private quarters, bathing everything in a light that seemed almost otherworldly. Pope Francis lay quietly in his bed, his breathing shallow but peaceful, the weight of his earthly years melting away moment by moment. Beside him, faithful as ever, lay Esteban. The little dog had refused food, refused sleep, content only to stay pressed against the bed where the man he loved was slowly slipping into eternity. Those who attended the Holy Father marveled at the scene. A dog keeping vigil more faithfully than any royal guard, a silent witness to one of the holiest farewells the world would ever know. From time to time, Pope Francis would stir, opening his tired eyes to look around the room. Sometimes he whispered a prayer, sometimes he simply smiled faintly at the faces gathered quietly around him. His closest advisors, a few dear friends, and always Esteban. No one had the heart to move the little dog. It seemed unthinkable to separate them now. A small crucifix had been placed gently in the Pope's hands, and the rosary he had prayed so faithfully through his life now rested on his chest. The sacrament of the anointing of the sick had been administered with quiet reverence, and the names of the poor, the forgotten, and the suffering that he had carried in his heart for so many years were entrusted once more into the hands of the merciful Savior he would soon meet. As the final hours slipped by, Esteban never shifted from his place. His brown eyes, filled with a depth of sadness no words could capture, remained fixed on the Holy Father. Those present would later say it was as if the dog, in his pure and instinctive love, understood that he was standing at the threshold of a great mystery, that he was accompanying his beloved master on the beginning of the most important journey of all. And as the final moment came, as Pope Francis surrendered his last breath to the Lord he had served so humbly and so faithfully, Esteban lifted his head just slightly, gave a soft, almost imperceptible whine, and then laid his head down once more against the sheets, refusing to leave the side of the one who had taught the world, by his life, how to love. When the final breath left the Holy Father's lips, a silence unlike any other fell over the room. It was a silence not merely of mourning, but of reverence, a holy, trembling silence, as if all of heaven itself had paused to welcome home a faithful son. Tears welled up in the eyes of those gathered, yet no one dared to disturb the moment. Esteban, the small and loyal companion, remained still at the side of the bed, his soft body pressed against the Pope's motionless hand. He made no sound, no frantic movement. Instead, he stayed there as if he understood more clearly than anyone else that this was not the end, but the beginning of a new, eternal life. As attendants gently moved about the room, preparing the body for the traditional rites, Esteban would not move. Attempts to coax him away were met with quiet resistance. He would lift his head, look up with sorrowful, pleading eyes, and then lay it back down on the Pope's bed, as if to say, "Not yet, not yet." It was clear that in his simple heart, Esteban was determined to remain by his master until the very last possible moment. And so, with the tenderness reserved for things sacred and holy, the Vatican staff allowed him to stay. It was a scene unlike any other, one that left even the most hardened of hearts softened, as a simple creature of God offered his last gift of loyalty to a man who had lived and died with love as his only crown. In the hours that followed, Esteban refused to leave. When the Swiss guards and the papal household began to make the formal preparations for the Holy Father's final procession, Esteban followed solemnly. He walked at the side of the body as it was reverently moved, step for slow step, from the private chambers toward the place where the faithful would soon come to pay their respects. Priests and bishops alike, seeing the little dog walking with such mournful dignity, felt tears rise unbidden to their eyes. It was as if Esteban knew he was participating in something greater than grief, something sacred, something eternal. And in that silent walk, he gave witness to the unbreakable bond of love that even death could not sever. As the solemn preparations continued, and as news spread like a ripple across the world that the Holy Father had passed into eternity, pilgrims began to flock to Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, already a place of ancient sorrow and endless prayer, prepared once again to cradle the mourning of the Church Universal. The body of Pope Francis was brought gently to lie in state, clothed in simple white, his face peaceful, as if he were merely resting after a long and faithful labor. And just a few steps away, almost unnoticed among the grandeur, Esteban remained. Vatican officials, moved by the beauty of his silent vigil, allowed the little dog to stay near, resting quietly on a small cushion placed lovingly for him beside the bier. Hour after hour, the faithful streamed past, peasants and princes, cardinals and simple workers, mothers carrying babies, old men clutching rosaries worn thin by decades of use. They came to say goodbye, to offer prayers, to whisper thank yous for a life poured out in service. Many wept openly as they passed by, their hands trembling with grief and gratitude. But almost without fail, as they looked toward the lifeless body of the Pope, their eyes were also drawn downward, to Esteban, lying there in humble, unwavering devotion. Some pilgrims paused and knelt before the dog as much as before the Pope, seeing in his quiet presence a living testimony of a love that neither fame nor power could corrupt. Esteban's brown eyes, heavy with sorrow yet filled with steadfast peace, gazed constantly at the one he loved, refusing to be distracted even by the waves of people pressing close. It was said among the mourners that Esteban's vigil was a prayer in itself, rising silently to heaven like the smoke of countless candles flickering in the Basilica. His presence seemed to touch hearts more deeply than any grand oration could. Journalists who came to cover the event lowered their cameras, priests who had prepared sermons found themselves speechless, and children who knew nothing of Vatican protocol instinctively understood and knelt near him, as if drawn into the sacredness of that holy farewell. In Esteban, the world saw the gospel preached without a single word, the gospel of loyalty, of humility, of love stronger than death. The day of the funeral dawned with the sky draped in a heavy, solemn gray, as if even nature mourned. Bells tolled over Rome, their deep voices calling the faithful to prayer, to memory, to gratitude. St. Peter's Square swelled with hundreds of thousands, pilgrims wrapped in coats against the morning chill, holding candles, rosaries, flags from every corner of the earth. They came because they loved him. They came because, somehow, he had reached into their hearts with the simplicity of his life, the mercy of his teachings, and the tenderness of his soul. And amidst it all, still faithfully by his side, was Esteban. He had been gently moved to a place near the altar, not to be a distraction, but because no one, not a single soul within the Vatican, had the heart to separate him from the one he loved. As the great Mass began, the solemn chants rising toward heaven, Esteban lay quietly at the edge of the sanctuary. His head rested upon his paws, his eyes never leaving the simple white coffin that bore the man who had lived for the gospel of mercy. Cardinals in crimson, bishops in gold, priests in white, all moved with ritual and reverence. The scriptures were proclaimed, the homily spoken with trembling voice, prayers lifted like incense into the sky. Yet through it all, there was a second, quieter sermon being preached, the sermon of a little dog who would not leave his master, who bore witness to a loyalty and a love that even death could not silence. Those gathered could feel it. The mourners who wept during the Eucharistic prayer saw not only the breaking of the bread, but the reflection of love made flesh in the humble figure lying silently near the altar. Esteban, without knowing it, had become a living sign of the Church's own heart. A heart broken but faithful, mourning but trusting, suffering but loving all the more fiercely. And when the prayers of commendation were sung, when the words, "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord," echoed under the towering dome, Esteban's ears flickered at the sound, as if he recognized the final goodbye being spoken over the one to whom he had given his whole heart. As the final hymn rose across St. Peter's Square and the slow procession began to carry the Holy Father's simple coffin toward its resting place, Esteban stood up. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet, his aging body trembling slightly with the effort. Those who witnessed it would later say they had never seen anything so heart-wrenching. The little dog, so steadfast, so determined, walking quietly behind the coffin as it moved forward. No one ordered him, no one restrained him. He simply followed, as he had followed Francis through every hallway, every garden path, every quiet prayer. And now he followed him into the silence of eternity. The coffin was brought to the crypt beneath the Basilica, to a place reserved for popes and saints, a place heavy with the prayers of centuries. Esteban padded behind the solemn line of cardinals and bishops, small and unnoticed by many, but seen by heaven itself. When they reached the tomb and the final prayers were said, Esteban lay down once again, just a few feet away. The burial rites continued, but he would not be moved. His silent presence seemed to fill the sacred space with an even greater holiness, a reminder that in the end, it is not thrones or titles that matter, but love, the pure, faithful love that reflects the very heart of God. The Vatican staff, seeing his devotion, allowed him to stay for a time. No one had the heart to force him away. Esteban remained there, lying close to the tomb, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. Visitors who came to pay their respects would find him there in the days that followed, a small, living testament to a friendship that had transcended death itself. They would kneel nearby and pray, often with tears, touched more by the sight of that little dog's love than by any sermon they could have heard. In Esteban's faithful vigil, the world was given one final, powerful image of the kind of love that Pope Francis had spent his life preaching, a love that was humble, steadfast, and forever faithful. As the days passed, Esteban remained a silent, gentle guardian near the tomb. Pilgrims and Vatican staff alike grew accustomed to seeing the small, faithful figure resting quietly there, his soft breathing a living prayer offered for the soul of his beloved master. He accepted water and food when offered, but he showed no interest in wandering, no desire to leave. His world had been anchored not in places or possessions, but in the beating heart of the man he had loved. And now that heart was at rest beneath the stones, and so Esteban stayed, as if keeping watch between earth and heaven. Eventually, after many tender days, the Vatican, moved by compassion and recognizing the deep bond between Esteban and Pope Francis, decided that the little dog would remain within the Vatican gardens, where he had walked so often with the Holy Father. A small shelter was built for him near one of the quiet chapels, where masses would often be offered for the repose of the Pope's soul. Esteban was cared for by the Vatican gardeners and a few kind-hearted Swiss guards who tended to him with a reverence usually reserved for sacred vessels. For in Esteban, they saw something holy, a living symbol of loyalty, of grief, of a love that bore witness to something far greater than any man could fully explain. Children who came to visit would kneel beside him and whisper prayers. Tourists who stumbled upon him would grow quiet, feeling instinctively that they were standing in the presence of something pure and rare. Even cardinals, busy with meetings and duties, would pause when they saw Esteban, lowering their heads in silent respect. It was said among the Vatican workers that Esteban had become a kind of unofficial guardian of love, a reminder left behind by the Holy Father to teach, even after his death, that the greatest sermons are not shouted from pulpits, but lived out in the small, faithful acts of the heart. And though Esteban never spoke a word, his silent vigil continued to move hearts, to soften cynicism, to awaken in countless souls a longing for the kind of love that endures beyond death, a love that never gives up, never walks away, never forgets. It was as if the spirit of Pope Francis himself, his compassion for the poor, his tenderness for the forgotten, his fierce belief in the mercy of God, had found a way to keep breathing in the small, steady heartbeat of a humble dog. In the quiet years that followed, Esteban remained a living memory of a pope who had taught the world about mercy, not with thunderous declarations, but with small, stubborn acts of love. As the seasons changed and the gardens bloomed and faded again and again, the little dog grew older. His steps slowed, his muzzle grew white, but his spirit never faltered. Visitors who asked about him were told his story, of the rainy morning when a pope had seen a shivering creature in need, of the countless silent walks through the Vatican gardens, of the final vigil by the tomb. In time, even those who had never met Pope Francis personally would come to the Vatican gardens simply to see Esteban, and through him to glimpse the tender heart of the man he had loved. It was said that near the end of his own earthly life, Esteban often sat by the small chapel at dusk, facing the tomb of Francis, his body too weak to walk far, but his spirit as faithful as ever. Those who passed by would see him there, his head lifted gently toward the chapel cross, as if offering his last prayers. And then, one cool morning, Esteban too quietly slipped away, leaving behind no fame, no riches, no monuments, only the memory of a love so fierce, so pure, that it became part of the very soul of the Vatican itself. Vatican officials, moved beyond words, laid him to rest in a quiet corner of the gardens, not far from the place where he had walked so many mornings with the Holy Father. A small plaque was placed there, simple and humble, just like the life it honored. It read, "Esteban, faithful companion, a witness to love that does not die." Pilgrims still come to that place. Some leave flowers, others leave notes of gratitude. Some kneel and weep, not only for the little dog, but for the Pope who taught them, through his life, his death, and through Esteban, that the greatest love is one that stays, one that forgives, one that endures when everything else passes away. In the end, Pope Francis's final homily was not spoken from the balcony of St. Peter's, but lived out quietly, tenderly, through the silent devotion of a small dog who refused to leave his side, even after his passing. And so the story of Francis and Esteban became, for those with eyes to see, a parable not just of friendship, but of the very heart of Christ, a heart that promises again and again, "I am with you always, until the end of the age." And somewhere beyond the gates of time, in the eternal gardens of heaven, a simple pope and a simple dog walk together once more, no longer in the shadow of sorrow, but in the endless, radiant joy of everlasting life.